Last session for the day. No falling asleep. All right, so we covered several virtues, but there are other critical virtues that we could look at. These just give you kind of a taste of the kind of teaching that we need to be doing as parents. Many of these would be covered indirectly if some of the other of these virtues were covered. You would end up kind of covering two in one. Being faithful and having peace and boldness and courage. These are things that the Bible would encourage. Gentleness and meekness, righteousness, godliness, purity. So when we extrapolate from what our kids are doing now that show a lack of these virtues and project those behaviors to what these things would look like in their adult forms, then we have to think through what will they look like, and will they displease God, those forms at that point, or not? And if so, then we have to help our kids to develop these virtues now while they're young. So a child isn't born with these virtues already intact. They have to be taught, and then the child trained and corrected in order for our kids to go in the way that they should go. We have to teach them that way, and so we teach them godly virtues. So how might we go about doing that, teaching these virtues? Well, maybe we make up scenarios in our minds and discuss these with our kids. We ask them, what should you do in this situation if this situation arose, and why? Maybe we make up fictional stories with characters who either exhibit certain virtues or fail to exhibit certain virtues, and we discuss that with the kids, various scenarios. We read books or watch shows and movies that can provide opportunities to discuss these virtues. We pause the shows or the movies and stop and discuss them whenever relevant. Movies can be a great tool for that in illustrating real-world situations. When you're reading the Bible or telling Bible stories, don't just read, but stop and highlight the virtue or the lack of a virtue in an individual or individuals in the stories. Tell real-life stories from your own past or from the past of others that you know, and what we or they should have done or not done with regard to the virtues. Now, those are all preemptive teaching, so it's after a mistake. After a mistake has already been made by a child, of course, it's essential that the situation be discussed. That's a great opportunity to teach virtues, but ideally we're going to be as preemptive as much as we can, and while we're doing these things, we're asking lots of questions. That helps to build understanding in them, and it also makes it where their mind is forced to engage and think through what to do instead of you just telling them what to do. So it's harder for your instruction to go in one ear and out the other when you're asking questions and expecting them to think through and answer those. Now, there's no doubt that all this takes a lot of time. It's extremely time-consuming to teach godly virtues, but that's what the Bible says to do in Deuteronomy 11 and elsewhere. Biblical parenting is time-consuming, but that's the job. It would be very difficult to do this on a day-to-day basis if we don't actually arrange our schedules in such a way where we can actually be with our kids as much as possible and actually give them our attention. We can't fill our schedules so full that we fail to do what's needed for our kids. Their futures, the futures of our descendants, and the future of the church will most certainly be affected by this. It was our choice to engage in the activities that led to their birth. It wasn't their choice. And so we have a responsibility to do what needs to be done for them. And let's face it, in America, we fill our lives with all kinds of things that are not necessary. We have that luxury, and they can be fine and even important in some cases within reason. But come on, they're not necessary. Or in many cases, they at least don't need to be a high priority, especially compared to our children. So we have to keep our perspective right on our responsibilities in God's sight, Our children must take precedence while they are young, especially. And that brings me to an important consideration. Where should evangelism fit with respect to child rearing in our priorities? Do our children come second to evangelism? Whenever we think about evangelism and mission work, I think we often get a picture in our mind of maybe door knocking or setting up Bible studies with people that we don't know, or going abroad and doing mission work in foreign fields, doing mission work in our own communities and in our neighborhood, and devoting time and energy to evangelizing these areas. And we feel like, hey, I've got to step it up and set up a Bible study so that my kids are just going to have to wait because this Bible study is more important. And so we'll prioritize mission work and evangelism of such individuals, knowing in the back of our minds that we're not really giving enough attention to teaching our own kids who we see some major deficiencies with. Now, wait a minute. Our children are a mission field. And in fact, as parents, they are our primary mission field that God has assigned us with working on. It isn't the nurturing, training, and ultimate conversion of our own children just as important as bringing the word outside of our home. While our children are young, that's got to be our priority. So moms, you shouldn't feel guilty about not having time to set up Bible studies with people. You have Bible studies set up already, and lots of them, if you understand your role in the home. And the same goes for dads. Our younger children must take precedence. They'll grow up one day, and then our evangelistic efforts can shift. Now, of course, I'm not saying that if an opportunity to speak the truth falls in your lap providentially, you should ignore that. I'm saying that a parent with young children who are not yet Christians should not feel compelled to neglect his duty to his children, to go search for others to evangelize when his children need him to devote his evangelistic efforts to their development. That person's children's spiritual development is not the responsibility of other parents, nor is it the responsibility of school teachers, Bible class teachers, the church, babysitters, society at large, the government. Now, as a side point, keep in mind that an implication of this concept is that while it's not the primary responsibility of parents of young children to be evangelists outside of the home, that means it's that much more the responsibility of other Christians to be sure to be being evangelistic towards the world when they don't have younger children to deal with. So bottom line, we have to keep our priorities straight. We're given specific examples of parents in the Bible who failed to have clarity on this. Eli was apparently so focused on his priestly duties that he failed to properly see to his children, 1 Samuel 3:13. Samuel was so busy traveling around judging Israel, 1 Samuel 7:16 through 17, that he apparently neglected his boys, 1 Samuel 8:3, leading to Israel demanding a king. David's demands as king apparently kept him from adequately parenting Adonijah, 1 Kings 1:6, leading to his attempt to usurp the throne. So when we choose to be parents, that responsibility becomes a high priority over most other responsibilities, save our marriage. It's a priority even over outside evangelism while our children are younger. Now, let's imagine for a moment that we don't teach these virtues to our children. It's not necessarily the case that our children won't get baptized, although it's no doubt true that we've made it much more likely that they won't obey the gospel by not teaching these things. But notice, even if they are baptized, number one, we've made it harder for them to serve God because of the extra struggles they're going to have with the basic virtues that they need in order to be pleasing to God. It'll be much more difficult for them to be focused on helping others if they're having to be focused on their own spiritual inadequacies. So if they know that their spirit lacks the virtues that God expects, then they're naturally going to have to focus on that rather than evangelism and being a salt to the world. But number two, getting baptized doesn't necessarily mean a person is saved, does it? It's not. Isn't it true that even within the church, most won't be saved? The church today is not unlike the church of Moses in the wilderness. And we know that hardly any of them made it into the promised land. Why didn't they? Well, because when we boil it down, it's because the Israelites as individuals had severe deficiencies in these virtues. They had a lack of contentment and gratitude, a lack of self-control, a lack of humility and holiness and so forth. Things that, had they been taught those virtues better from a young age, would have helped them to do what's right when the going gets tough. Now, on the other hand, imagine for a moment a child who's been trained to have all of these virtues. What kind of person would he be? What kind of leavening influence would he be on the world? What kind of Christian would he be? A completely honest man, in control of his impulses and emotions, who takes responsibility for his mistakes, who never complains but is positive, being content and even grateful for his lot in life, even when things go wrong, who submits to authority and is obedient, who'd never have a rebellious spirit about him or be the cause of others being rebellious, who has his pride in check, recognizing his inadequacies as a human. He's consistently thoughtful of others, considerate of others. He's quick to give his time and money to help other people. He's patient. He doesn't fly off the handle. He works hard. He's not lazy. He's very pious, being deeply involved in religion, worship, and matters of the church. He's holy. He is set apart from the world. He's different, but he's comfortable with that. He's devoted himself to growth in knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, so he makes good decisions. He can be counted on for good advice. He's kind and good to others, as well as merciful and compassionate. He's not quick to condemn others, and he's very serious about modesty, not drawing attention to himself, but drawing attention to others, and especially to Christ. Imagine training a child to be that person. No wonder Satan is busily involved in distracting parents from taking the time to do that, to teach these things. In Luke 8, Jesus likens individuals who hear the truth to different types of soil: wayside soil, rocky, thorny, and good soil. So think about that for a moment. Is a person born a certain soil type? Now, he's either good soil or he's not. There's nothing he can do about it. Now, of course not. He is a product of his decisions, the things that have happened to him, and he's a product of his upbringing. Good soil isn't born. It's not automatic. A person is taught how to be good soil and trained and corrected from a young age to be good soil. And also notice, child rearing, once again, isn't merely about getting our children to the baptistry. The good soil represents the individual who hears the word and doesn't just become a Christian. He remains faithful and even bears fruit. So notice, that's implying virtues. He's been taught how to be virtuous. Well, if we let behaviors go that fall under these categories, our children will not be developing these virtues. They'll be developing habits that will lead to spiritual death whenever they're accountable. The hard thing is the application, though, of these virtues in a day-to-day way. It's easy to tell a kid, hey, you need to be respectful. And it's easy to pull out a dictionary and read the definition of respect to him. But most of that's going to go over their heads, right? The hard thing is to have the wisdom as a parent to know what disrespect or pride or a lack of self-control looks like when it plays out in the real world in a day-to-day way with our kids. So you shall know them by their fruits again. There are fruits that will result if a person lacks a certain virtue. Being a fruit picker as a parent is essential to making sure that we're addressing the heart of our kids, not just specific actions. And so we should constantly pray for wisdom and discernment and understanding as parents, like Solomon's humble prayer in 1 Kings chapter 3. I remember he said, I'm like a child, right? I'm like a child myself in knowledge about this crucial job of parenting. And yet your servant is in the midst of these little children that you have blessed me with. Please, Lord, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge these children, that I may discern between good and evil. We shouldn't be surprised when we see our children or others' children lacking these virtues at times. That's normal and expected. We shouldn't be surprised by that. If they didn't lack virtues, then there'd be no point in having parents. No, we shouldn't be surprised if our child has a lack of a virtue. That shouldn't bother us as much when we see that. What should be bothersome when we look out at the world and see a lack of virtue that should concern all of us is when a child's lack of virtue either isn't being addressed by his parents Or is it being addressed adequately whenever we see a clear example of a deficiency of that virtue? So it's not as much a concern to me when I see a child throw a tantrum or whine or complain. That's going to happen before a child is trained. But it is a concern if we don't see the parents putting a stop to it. It's not bothersome as much when we see a child being selfish. That's natural. It bothers us. It should bother all of us if we don't see a parent effectively addressing that problem, because we should all be able to see the ultimate outcome of that child's life if that issue is not handled. Okay, step one, teaching. Now, here's the thing. I think there may be a misunderstanding at this point in child rearing. Many parents apparently aren't even teaching virtues, but even among those who are, from observation of those parents, it seems to me, and you as well, I'm sure, that many parents who teach virtues seem to believe that their responsibility, pretty much in totality, only goes that far. They've done their job if they've simply taught their kids about these virtues, and the rest is just left up to them, their conscience, and God's providential work and guidance in their life. It's in the Lord's hands now, they say to themselves. And so they excuse themselves from responsibility when their kids fail to behave as they should. It's not my responsibility. I can't make them do anything. It's between them and God, they say. Well, question, has simply knowing the virtues given you mastery over them? And the answer is no, because we all have certain virtues that we know about, we've been taught, and yet we still haven't mastered them. We all still struggle with them. But parents will sometimes think to themselves, if I just bring the kids to church and have devos at night and make sure they read their Bibles, I've done my job, and only time will tell what's going to happen. In other words, I've taught them. That's my job. That's it. Oh, well, again, has mere knowledge alone worked for you in being virtuous in all the ways that we've looked at in this series so far? We all know you could teach a child until you turn blue, but that doesn't ensure that a child's going to develop a virtue. A child could quote the entire Bible and have perfect remembrance of every word of the Bible. He is thoroughly taught in God's word and still be rotten as a child, right? Many, many people over the centuries have known immense amounts of Scripture, and they still didn't submit themselves to the way of God. Imparting knowledge alone isn't the job. It's essential, but it's not sufficient. No, the virtues that characterize us as individuals are the virtues we were trained to have, especially when younger. It's not just knowing a virtue, it's being trained in it, which is step 2 of parenting. So if Deuteronomy 6:7 is our thematic verse for step 1, Proverbs 22:6 would definitely be a thematic verse for step 2. Train up a child in the way he should go if you want him to behave that way later. You know, it's tempting to let a child do what he wants to do, even if it's not good for him. Yeah, I want him to be happy, so I'll indulge him, we tell ourselves. I'll let him run a little wild, so it'll make him happier. The problem is that that's not what's really going to make us happy, right? Happiness comes from having rules, having boundaries, especially Bible-based boundaries, and then our keeping them. Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint, but happy is he who keeps the law. And so we must train our children to keep God's laws. Well, what are we getting at with this idea? What does that look like? Well, what do we do if we want to memorize something? Well, we probably rep it. Read it over and over, listen to it over and over. Maybe we come up with little tricks to help us remember it, associate concepts in an acronym. You know, maybe we come up with tunes to help us remember something. If we want to learn how to play a sport well, we practice over and over, day in and day out. If we want to execute a play or maneuver effectively in a game, then we want to have it down where it's second nature to us, where we don't even have to think about it when it counts. If we want to learn how to play an instrument well, we rehearse over and over, day in and day out. In short, we train. And what we mean by that is we're practicing something until it becomes habitual. We're practicing to develop habits, which is an important word to help us understand this concept of training. So what happens when you're in the habit of doing something? Well, you do it, whether or not you want to. Habits are hard to break, right? saying certain words that might be considered rude, chewing with your mouth open, interrupting others, whatever it is. Habits, they're hard to break. Well, we tend to think of bad habits when we talk about habits, but it goes the other way too. Habits can be really handy. Walking, that's a habit. The ability to speak a language, that's a habit. Eating and drinking, reading. When we're trained in these things, they become so ingrained that they're habitual, and we therefore have them for life. We don't even have to think about how to do those things that are habits. And notice, unlearning those things would now be difficult. Well, the same goes for developing these character traits, whether they're good or bad ones. And so we should take advantage of the power of habits in our parenting. We should take advantage of that. Those behaviors we practice to habit will become part of our character. They become traits, characteristics that are used to signify who we are. If we want our kids not to depart from the right path when they're older, we'll train them to be a certain way now, practicing, repeating, rehearsing over and over. So how does that work in child rearing, practically speaking? How do we help them develop these habits? Well, obviously that would include addressing violations of the virtues every time they occur. We'll talk about what we mean by correcting in step 3. Confronting a child's behavior starts a child thinking about the behavior, at least on the back of his mind. And that's a form of training. It's just not sufficient. Correcting here and there when and if opportunities arise that'll allow you to address a particular virtue, that's too sporadic, it's too spread out, and it may not even address all the virtues you need to deal with. And kids have short attention spans. More is needed beyond merely correcting here and there. So we address violations consistently, so every time the behavior happens, without exception. So notice that goes further in helping a child to develop good habits. Consistency trains. There's no doubt about that. In their excellent book, To Train Up a Child, Michael and Debbie Pearl explain how training works in an extremely simple way. And one of the illustrations that they use that comes from lessons that we can learn from animal trainers. They make some interesting points about this. For example, they explain that training a dog can be pretty simple if the trainer is consistent, and consistency is key. So if, for example, you were using a shock collar on a dog, they gave him a light jolt every time he tried to leave the yard. It doesn't take long for even an unintelligent animal to learn not to leave the yard, right? He's trained. Now, after training him, you don't even have to use the shock collar anymore. He stays in the yard. But if your collar was defective and only shocked the dog sporadically when he's being trained, what's going to happen? Even if it only misses a shock once in 10 attempts, it has a totally different effect. If there's something outside the yard that the dog wants, he might risk it. I mean, after all, he's been able to make it before. He just needs to try again. And eventually he's going to get what he's craving. But again, if the dog consistently, without exception, receives that jolt, he's not going to try anymore. He's intelligent enough to know that. How much more would we expect an intelligent child to obey with consistent training? And the result would be, of course, the child's gaining virtues that are so habitual that they become ingrained and part of his character. Now, there's implications to what I'm saying. You can only be consistent in training if you're attentive. We have to be watching. We can't be too distracted. So while being trained, the child can't be off by himself all the time or being watched by others who don't know what we're trying to do or being trained by a TV and movie all the time. Now, yes, it may be a hassle, but attentiveness is necessary for effective training. Someone says, well, I want to give him independence. I don't want to micromanage him. Well, that's great when he's ready for that. But I see a bunch of kids that are running around without supervision that clearly aren't ready for independence. You seeing that? They're not handling their independence very well. Why? Well, because they haven't been fully trained to be independent yet. If they were well trained, they could handle it. Training him in the way he should go will cause him to go in that way when he's ready, but not if the training isn't complete. Another implication, everything we consistently do or don't do trains a child. In other words, it helps form a habit in our child. So for example, Everything a parent emphasizes or doesn't emphasize on a day-to-day basis trains a child in some way. It trains a child to emphasize what we emphasize. So if we tend to let some inappropriate behavior slide, then we're portraying those behaviors to a child as being less important. Well, obviously, the kids are then trained to think that way about those behaviors. If we emphasize honesty with our children, telling the truth at all costs, we're training a child to emphasize honesty as well. But if we let dishonesty creep by without addressing it, little white lies, allowing our kids to talk their way out of punishment, not following through with what we said would happen if the child does certain things, we're emphasizing to our children that honesty isn't a big deal. We're training them. When we fail to emphasize the importance of submission and compliance when we give instructions, forcing our children to consistently obey our instructions and in the proper spirit, if we fail to emphasize that, our children are being trained not to emphasize proper submission and obedience. When we miss worship or church events here and there, when it's inconvenient or when other things get in the way every now and then, we're training our kids to consider the prioritization of church as lower than certain things. It's not that big of a deal all the time. Everything we do or don't do in a consistent way trains a child for good or bad. The Pearls give an example of a horse whose owner had trained him to respond to his command to giddy up. Now, the problem is that the owner would, in his frustration, yell every time he gave that command. And so the horse learned to only giddy up when the person in the wagon yelled the command. So the horse was trained to respond when he heard certain words and words spoken in a certain way. Okay, now have you ever seen kids that only seem to respond to commands when the parent is yelling or making certain threats? They ignore the parent until the parent's command rises to a certain frequency and volume, and then all of a sudden they kick into gear. Well, they were trained to do that. If they were trained to respond to the first command, even if it was a whisper, then they would respond accordingly. That's how training works. So bottom line, inconsistency in following through with correction fails to train a child. It's a failure on our part to do our God-given job. And I'm certainly not claiming infallibility in this area. Consistency is hard. It gets in the way in our life. There's no doubt. But I have to acknowledge that when I fail to be consistent, it's on me. Don't pass the buck. I've got to have the virtue of responsibility too. I got to take responsibility for my own inadequacies as a parent. In his book, The New Strong-Willed Child, renowned author and child psychologist James Dobson quotes 18th century mother Susanna Wesley, who bore 19 children. And here's what she said: "For by neglecting timely correction, they will contract a stubbornness, an obstinacy which is hardly ever after conquered, and never without using such severity as would be painful to me as to the children. In the esteem of the world, those who withhold timely correction," talking about consistency, "would pass for kind and indulgent parents," right? To the world, these parents look like they're kind and indulgent, "whom I call cruel parents, who permit their children to get habits which they know must afterward be broken. Nay, some are so stupidly fond as in sport to teach their children to do things which in the afterwhile they must severely beat them for doing." Right? This is logical what she's saying here. And so we correct and do so consistently. But while that's extremely important, notice addressing bad behavior after the fact, whether consistently or not, is responsive. So by that point, obviously, it's already too late to stop the behavior before it happens. Correction is responsive. It's not preemptive. So if we care about our kids and want to make it easier on them, both now and in the future, wouldn't it make sense to be preemptive instead of responsive in our training? So anticipate what the issues are going to be and prepare our child for those moments before they actually occur. So preemptive training is preparing for the day of temptation and helping our kids to get ready for that before they fail in it in that day. This is a logical outlook that springs from Proverbs 22 and verse 3. A prudent man foresees or anticipates evil or danger, and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. So if we're wise and want to teach our children to be wise, then we have to anticipate temptations that they're going to face and teach them how to do that. And thereby they'll make fewer mistakes and cause less heartache in their lives. So how might we do that? Well, again, think in terms of practice and repetition of certain virtuous behaviors so that they become ingrained. Maybe you set up pretend scenarios that require one of the virtues that you discuss with the kids and have them walk through the motions of the right words to help them practice. And so you actually announce each time to the kids, all right, kiddos, training time. It's a game. Our kids would love training time, so they'd come running from all different directions, and we make it a big game, training time. And what we're doing is we're going to literally walk through and practice appropriate behavior for different situations. Now, obviously, the training sessions would be different depending upon the age of the child, with the key being the ability of the child to understand what you're wanting from him. So you can't expect as much from a 6-month-old as you would a 2-year-old, obviously. But as a general rule of thumb, you have to keep in mind that as intelligent beings with a God-given soul, they're capable of way more than we often give them credit for. So we should hold the bar high enough. So maybe for self-control training, you might have a child sit very still for 5 minutes without getting up or getting fidgety. And this is the game, And maybe you have him not talk for 5 minutes. And you practice that several times. As he gets older, maybe you increase the number of minutes. For honesty, you might make up scenarios that would be tempting for the child to be dishonest about. So, for instance, he knows he's not supposed to roughhouse in the dining room, but he does, and he breaks a dish. Okay, talk him through it. What will he be tempted to do? Oh, he's going to be tempted to claim innocence. We'll walk him through the repercussions of that decision, as opposed to just owning up to it. Another scenario, maybe he really wants a piece of candy on the coffee table. His mom already gave him a cookie today, so he knows his parents aren't going to want him to have more sugar. So what might he be tempted to do? Well, maybe he's tempted to go to Daddy behind her back and say, well, I didn't eat any sweets today. Can I have some candy? And so you walk him through the scenario. What would be the consequences of each choice? Another one, maybe he really wants to watch his favorite show, but Mommy said he's watched enough TV today. So what's he going to be tempted to do? His dad comes home from work. Oh, Daddy, Mommy said I can watch a show. Can you turn it on for me? You walk him through, what's the dangers of that? Maybe he's finished his homework, but his friends really want him to go out and play. So what should he do? What will he be tempted to do? Kind of help him think through that. And so you lay out the scenarios and walk him through what he should do in those situations to be honest. For responsibility, maybe you make up scenarios that would tend to lead to a child not wanting to take responsibility for his actions or for passing blame. He spills milk on Dad's computer. He breaks Mom's vase, makes a royal mess in the living room. He forgets to finish her chores before she goes and plays with her Legos. And again, you talk her through what should she do to be responsible, as opposed to making excuses and passing blame or denying wrongdoing. You're practicing with them. For contentment, maybe you pick a chore that the child doesn't like, and you have him practice doing the chore with a smile, maybe with dancing and singing while he's working. Thinking about positive things while he's working. Maybe have your child hand his sibling his favorite toys to play with while he keeps his less favorite ones. And he has to play with that one toy for 10 minutes and keep a smile on the whole time and think positive thoughts of having the toy that he has as opposed to having nothing. For gratitude, you have the child list 10 things that he's grateful for in 60 seconds. Or maybe you have him list 2 things he really doesn't like, whether it's a food, a show, a certain place he doesn't like going, whatever. But then you have him list 5 things that are good about each of those 2 things. Things that he can be grateful for about those things. For obedience, this is an important one. You can have lots of simple commands, one by one, including commands that'll be helpful to you later. Like drop what's in your hand, stop moving, don't make any noise, sit down, run over there, bring me that. Go touch that pole until I say stop, and they have to quickly obey with a good attitude. And so you're training your kids to obey and follow God-ordained authority immediately without thought, just helping them develop this habit. Maybe you practice giving them a special command that signals that they need to stop what they're doing immediately and come to you. Julie and I have a special whistle noise that we do with our mouth so that the kids will hear us even in a public place and come to us even if we're in public and spread out, where we can immediately call them and they come to us and nobody else knows what's going on. Training for submission deserves a little extra comment. We've all seen various levels of disobedience and insubordination in kids, right? You have the child who's told to do something and he just totally ignores his parents. He pretends not to hear, or he communicates that he really just doesn't care what you're saying. He just doesn't need to obey. And so he's your Cain who totally ignores God's encouragement and does what he wants. He goes and kills Abel. You have the defiant child, and there's different versions of this. You have the child that's told to do something and he flat out says no, and his lips usually out. Like the men of Sodom and Gomorrah who Lot tried to warn, and they essentially told him to hush it. Genesis 19. Or Jonah, who was told to go preach to Nineveh, he flat out went the opposite direction. Or the people who Jeremiah confronted about worshiping other gods, who replied, "As for the word that you've spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we will not listen to you." Right? That's the adult version of that, right? I'm not going to do it. All right, now tell me, where does that attitude start? Where does it come from, right? It starts when a person's young and his parents haven't trained his attitude. And then you have the child who's told to do something and he looks directly at his mother with his lip out, maybe his hands crossed, and he doesn't say no verbally, but he directly says no non-verbally. I think of Elijah before his showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and he confronts the people of Israel saying, "How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." But the people answered him not a word. Well, they did kind of give him an answer, didn't they? Their answer was no. I'm good. Then you have the child that says, "Oh, I don't want to," and they resist. I think of Lot's wife. She may have ultimately gone, but it was clearly against her will. And she looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Or Zechariah, John the Baptizer's father, Luke 1, who had his faithless excuses for not immediately believing and complying with God's instructions. Then you have the child that says, "Why? Why do I have to?" Where you have to prove your case to a 3-year-old before he'll choose to grant you obedience. And here I'm reminded of Eve, who instead of immediate, unquestioning obedience to God, she expected to have a good reason before she would obey God. And so Satan provided her with good reasons not to. Or Moses in Exodus 3 and 4, who had every excuse under the sun for not obeying God and leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Then you have the child that goes ahead and obeys, but he does it with his lip out. Mutiny is on his mind. He's obedient, but he's not submissive. He's biding his time. He's waiting for the rebellion. Here I'm reminded of Pharaoh, who ultimately allowed the Israelites to go, but because he didn't have a submissive attitude about it, he ultimately retracted his decision and went after the Israelites. Or Jonah, when he finally obeyed, remember it was still with a mutinous attitude. He clearly still didn't want what God wanted for the Ninevites. And then you have the child who plans to obey, but he has other priorities that he considers to be more important to attend to first. What he needs to do is very important compared to your wishes, gathering his toys, finishing his dessert. I'm reminded of Luke 9, where a couple individuals were willing to follow Jesus, but they had other priorities they wanted to attend to first. Jesus had to rebuke them for that. Then you have the child who obeys, but does it slowly and mopily with his head down. Okay. And here I'm reminded of Lot again. God in his grace sent angels to warn Lot and his family to leave the cities of the plain. Genesis 19:16 says that Lot lingered. So then while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside of the city. So God being merciful to him essentially pushes him out of the city. Notice the fact that the text says God showed mercy on Lot for lingering. That implies Lot shouldn't have been lingering. He should have rushed to obey God. And finally, you have the child who says, "Yes, sir," and essentially runs to obey with a good attitude. He's not just obedient, he is submissively obedient. Like Isaiah, he says, "Here I am, send me." Isn't it clear which one God expects? And if God expects it, then we have to train our kids to be that way now. Train up a child now, and the way he should go then. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. Remember that submission is different from obedience. You can comply on the outside, technically doing what you're supposed to be doing, but have a bad attitude about it. And so you could be obedient but not submissive. Recall Isaiah 1:19, "If you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land." There's a difference between being obedient and being willing about it. Obedience is outward. Submission involves the inward being. And so how do we achieve that form of obedience? Well, here's a biblical recommendation. When our kids are old enough to understand the words, we teach them the phrase, how do we obey, kids? First, fast, and with a good attitude. First, before they do whatever it is they want to do. Recall again Jesus' response in Luke 9 to those who wanted to do other things before obeying him. And so when we as parents say, "Come here, Johnny," and Johnny does a couple other things before coming to us, and we allow that as though we're begging him as our master to grant us obedience. The child isn't being trained to understand what submission to God means. He'll struggle to be submissive to God and to authority in general. So you might allow our kids to ask us if they can do something else first, but they have to already be obeying before they ask. They're already on the move. Obey first, obey fast, not lollygagging or moping, which both show a rebellious spirit. That's not submission. Revelation 4:8 speaks of the 6 wings on the creatures surrounding the throne of God, representing swift obedience. When we as parents start doing the counting game, "Now, Johnny, I need you to obey me. I'm going to count to 3. What's he learning by that? Well, he's learning, first of all, that he doesn't have to obey immediately. I mean, he's got a good 3 seconds to keep doing what he wants. And let's face it, he's learning that his parents are kind of weak. He doesn't have to fear them. He doesn't have to fully respect them. Do we want them to obey fast when they're by the wood pile and you see a black widow spider there? Do we want them to obey fast when they're in the street and a car's about to hit them? Do we want to have to play the counting game? This isn't rocket science. Do we want them to be trained to pause and consider whether they'll decide to grant you obedience? Or do we want them to immediately comply? So again, does God tolerate lollygagging obedience? But, your Lot attitude. No. Does God count to 3 before he expects obedience? And if not, then why would we train our kids to treat authority that way? We have to train our kids in a way that submissive obedience is instinctual. We speak, they obey. Why? Because God speaks, we obey. And to train up a child, Michael Pearl relates a story where he's in an old truck with his daughters behind him in the truck. And it became apparent that something's wrong with the batteries that are located behind his seat, and his car's about to explode. And so he says, "Get out of the car." And they didn't ask why. Why? Right? He didn't have to play the counting game. Their door was jammed, so they literally jump out of the windows. All right, so we train them to obey fast. It can save their lives, both their physical and spiritual lives. Obedience, first, fast, and also with a good attitude about it. That's essential to make sure the child is submissive, not just obedient. And I want to take a moment to make this point sink in. It seems clear to me that in their disciplining procedures, many parents tend to focus on action alone and aren't really addressing the attitude of the child. So when we see a parent say, "Come here, Johnny," and the child obeys, but is argumentative about it or sulking or reluctant or whiny about it, and the parent allows that, then the child isn't being trained to understand what submission means to God. Some kids may even say sorry. You tell the kid, "You need to say sorry for what you..." "Sorry." They do with that terrible attitude, right? Well, again, will God accept a Christian who follows through the motions of Christianity, but whose attitude about it stinks? No, he's not going to accept that. That's what Jesus addressed over and over with the Jews of his day, because they had that problem. They focused on the details of the law, the outward compliance, but failed to have the essential spiritual virtues that indicated a good heart. That's what he was digging at over and over. Notice what he said in Matthew 12. Brood of vipers. Jesus didn't seem to be that concerned with being politically correct. You bunch of snakes. How can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. You guys are rotten to the core, into your guts. You're filthy. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. Well, I mean, if that's true, then isn't it important to address the heart? The attitude of the child inwardly, not just his outward actions. So Jesus said, are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach, is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts. So all these external things, they start in the heart. That's the issue. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. Luke 6:43 through 45, for a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit, for every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. So again, he's emphasizing this is not just about outward compliance. Those are just symptoms of the problem. We've got to address the problem. It's the heart. James weighs in on it. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Solomon, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. Verse 23:7, for as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. 1 Samuel 16:7, God speaking to Samuel, but the Lord said to Samuel, don't look at his appearance or at his height or at the height of his stature, because I've refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So if the Lord looks at the heart, and our job is to get our kids prepared for serving the Lord, then don't we need to address their heart, their attitudes, what's going on inside? Or Stephen, in his speech to the Jews before he was stoned, he said, this is that Moses whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt. Right? They kept going towards the promised land, but in their hearts, they weren't really. They had a bad attitude. Now, what would you think if you told your doctor that you're having severe pain in your stomach, and instead of looking into the cause of the pain, he just gave you pain medication and sent you home? I mean, hey, the surface issue's been resolved. You don't have any pain anymore, right? But the problem is that there could be a major problem inside of you, and all the doctor's done is handled the symptom. See, we have to keep in mind that we could adjust a child's exterior behavior, but not really be fixing the problem that is going to condemn them. Bad external behavior is only important because of the underlying heart implications that cause the behavior. The heart has to be addressed. Fix the heart, and you'll fix external behavior simultaneously. Telling a child not to brag might stop him from bragging, but it's not going to stop him from thinking he's better than others. You got to address that issue. Telling a child not to kick his sister or to touch his, whenever she tried to touch his stuff, it might encourage him not to be violent, but it's not going to stop him from feeling hatreds toward her when certain things happen, or from feeling covetous of material possessions. Those things have got to be addressed, not just the kicking. Telling a child not to talk back to his mom might fix the external disrespectful attitude, but it's not going to fix his disrespectful heart and mind, which is really what caused the behavior in the first place. The attitude has to be addressed by the things that we say and work on with our children. So bottom line, if we want them to obey and be submissive about it, we'll train them to obey first, fast, with a good attitude. Why is that important? Well, because God expects the same from us. Prioritizing Him and His wishes first in our lives. Obeying Him right away with a good attitude, not stopping and questioning Him. Why? Or ignoring Him so that we do, I don't want to just sing. I want to play while we do music too. Okay, that's a bad attitude. You're not viewing this right. God expects us to trust and obey him. Trust that he knows more than us and knows what's best for us. A child has to obey us submissively because he should trust that we know more than him and know what's best for him. God expects us to trust him and obey because, let's face it, he's the boss. He's in charge, and we have to respect his authority or we'll suffer the consequences. And he expects us to obey him submissively as a show of our love and appreciation towards him. Similarly, a parent should train a child to obey submissively because the parent's the boss, not the child. It's the parent's way or the highway. God expects us to obey him submissively because it's a show of our gratitude towards him when we do, thankfulness for what he's done, for his mercy, his grace. Immediate, compliant obedience is a show of love, John 14:15. And so again, we as parents should train our kids to be submissively obedient since it teaches them how to show love and gratitude towards their parents. You could stand in front of the mirror, maybe with your kiddo, and he's about 18 months to 2 years old, and practice facial expressions with him. Pouty, sad, mad, fussy, happy. Emphasize you want them to be happy. Maybe you show the pouty face to them in the mirror with your lip out, and you teach them, okay, push in the button and turn it into a smile, right, with the little kid, right? You use your finger by the mouth and you poke it into the corner of your mouth and twist it like a screw. You show him how he can twist a sad or pouty face into a smile. And when he gets the concept of a smile, you can then give him commands and remind him to do it with a smile. Now, granted, it took us a little while to get Celeste out of the habit of putting her finger up on the corner of her mouth every time she smiled, but it was worth it. So when we train our kids to obey submissively, they'll more easily transfer that compliant attitude and behavior to the ultimate authority whenever they get older. So for each of these virtues, training exercises could be developed and practiced, and I give ideas for these in Volume 2 of Train Up a Child, the Train Up a Child in the Way You Should Go book. And I don't have time to get into these for every one of these. To help develop trust, for example, you could have the child jump to you in the pool from the edge of the pool. You could have a game where you blindfold the child, stand behind him, have him fall backwards into your arms, where they have to trust you. Maybe while you're out with the kids on a Saturday at the store or whatever, you might say to the kiddos, go touch that pole. Whenever I would do that for Celeste, I do that with the kids in general. When I would do that on Saturdays years ago, the kids would get in training mode and they'd get all excited. It's a big game. And so, okay, go touch the pole. And the kids would go run and touch the pole. And while they're over there 15 yards away, sometimes I might walk around the corner for a few seconds just to see if they'll obey me completely without letting go of that pole, right? And that was hard for Celeste because she would get insecure and start panicking whenever I went out of sight. Oh no, we've been abandoned. And so she was like Peter, starting to sink when he saw the rough sea around him, right? And so I knew she'd do that, but she needed to learn to trust me. And why? Because I'd proven myself to be trustworthy. And so I would allow her to experience that and work through it, to train her to trust that she's not in control. She's got to trust her dad. He's trustworthy. She can trust him. And so after a few minutes, I'd call the kids from around the corner and they'd come running. And then I'd crouch down and have a little talk with Celeste to reason through about that, what happened. And so again, we practice these things. And so with a little thought, you can come up with many more training session ideas, no doubt, but you get the idea. So again, we're trying to develop habits, and specifically we're trying to make a virtuous life habitual. So we're talking about training, practicing, using exercises to develop habits. But let's face it, sometimes they're not motivated to do what you're asking, especially when they're smaller. Maybe they're indifferent, distracted, sloppy in their obedience, whiny, mopey about it. They're not obeying first fast with a good attitude. Maybe the little 10-month-old just doesn't understand English yet enough. Maybe he just doesn't understand that he has to obey you. I mean, that's going to be a new concept. He wants to touch the socket. Why would the sound no coming out of your face mean he can't do that? Well, an emphasis action on your part will be needed when we're first starting this to get his attention, to communicate your wishes to him and to help him to start realizing who's in charge. He can't just do what he wants to do. And so you have to emphasize that he needs to do as he's told. We're talking about a pop on the hand or a thump. It's just a little sting. You want to train him to associate a behavior first with the word no, and second, to associate no with discomfort when that word is used. And consistency is going to be key, and that consistent reinforcement may be necessary for different commands that we're training for several months, depending upon the child and, of course, depending upon how consistent we are. But keep in mind, this is not designed to be a punishment. This isn't the correction of step 3. This is more of a reinforcement of what you're expecting to happen. It's really more communication to help with the training process. So, for example, you take a toddler, probably able to crawl and get into things for the first time. And she's grabbing dangerous things and putting them into her mouth. And she's going places you don't want her to go. And obviously, you're concerned about her health and you're concerned about her safety. You love her. But the problem is that she doesn't yet understand the concept that you're in charge. I mean, how could she? It's not like she's just immediately intuitive like that when they come out of the chute. So they have to be taught and trained to understand this concept. So it's training time. And so when you're first beginning this training, the child could be as young as 6 months old or as old as 8 to 10 months old, depending upon the child. And the commands we're using to train them are usually going to be negatives. Instead of telling them what to do, we have to tell them what not to do. Don't touch daddy's glasses. And when they start crawling, it becomes things like don't touch the computer, don't touch the socket, don't get on the stairs, don't go to into the kitchen or into the bathroom. And so let's say she tries to grab your computer or tablet. She gets a little thump, a little pop on the hand along with the word no. There's no anger, emotion involved. This isn't a showdown between you and the child. This isn't correction. She's just learning cause and effect. She tries it again. You pop her little hand while you say no again. She tries it again. You pop her again while you say no again. She tries it again. Well, now you don't have to do it anymore. You don't have to pop her anymore. No, you have to keep doing it. You've got to be consistent about it. And after she tries that a few times, depending upon the personality you're dealing with, she begins to learn what no means. It means don't do certain things because it's not comfortable, and it's not comfortable every time. And the positive feelings that she had about indulging her craving to touch now changes to negative feelings when she tries to indulge her craving. It's painful now. So naturally, not being a brain-damaged child and therefore being interested in self-preservation, she decides it would be to her best benefit not to touch whatever it is that she wanted to touch anymore. She's getting trained. Okay, now is that valuable? So when she's trained to understand the concept of no, that you're in charge and that it hurts to do things that you say no about, then you get rewarded because after she gets the concept, it's now a lot easier to go around the house and highlight the things that are no-nos. All the sockets, not just that one, and the stairs, and the medicine cabinet, and the ladder, and the fireplace, and the computers, and the swimming pools, and the cabinet under the sink or the pantry, whatever it might be. And as long as you're consistent with your reinforcement for a period of time, she'll get to a point where she'll give up and not try those things. In fact, she'll get to the point where you merely say no, and you won't even need to thump because she quickly pulls her hand away from whatever it is without it. She's been trained. And notice no anger is necessary. There's no yelling. There's no threats. There's no bribes. We're just calmly practicing, training him to have good habits from an early age before he's even going to be old enough to remember the training. His brain hasn't developed enough to help solidify long-term memories until about 7 or 8 years. And now to offset the constant no's, it's also good practice to give your child yeses. Take him to several toys and his cup and this pacifier, your leg, and say yes. Put his hand on whatever the items are. But then show him again various no-nos to distinguish the two. Another concept regarding training protocols. To train up a child, the Pearls emphasize that we shouldn't have to child-proof our home if we're doing the training right. With correct training, we home-proof our child instead. I like that concept. They make the point that God could have placed the tree of knowledge of good and evil out of reach, where Adam and Eve wouldn't have a problem resisting the urge to eat from it. But it wasn't. It was put in the midst of the garden, Genesis 2:9. It was there for Adam and Eve to decide whether they were going to control themselves and obey God or not. It's really what the choice all of us have. That's how life is going to be for a child. Temptations are going to be there in their midst. And so if all temptations are removed from their sight, then they won't be prepared to deal with them when they come later. And so the key is for parents to train them to control themselves and resist those temptations. And so in training sessions, instead of taking the tree of knowledge of good and evil out of the garden, put your phone or glasses on the ground in the living room and put your child down in the room and watch him until he finds them. We're not tempting the child. We're testing and training the child like God did with the Israelites in Exodus 16:4, Exodus 20:20, Deuteronomy 8:2, Deuteronomy 2:16, Judges 2:22. This is all over the Bible where God uses this technique. And so when the child sees the phone in the midst of the garden and goes for it, the training session begins. Now, granted, it's more of a hassle to keep the tree in the midst of the garden. It's time consuming. There's more potential that there's going to be broken things, spills, but wouldn't it be better to sacrifice some of those material things for the spiritual and physical health of our children? Which brings us back to the ultimate goal of parenting. Parents have a God-ordained responsibility to take the necessary time to properly teach and train a child what he needs to know and how he needs to behave to be ready for a life of service to God. Now, the good thing about training sessions, again, is that they're preemptive. They're not responsive. So you don't have to wait around all day staring at the child until he does something he shouldn't do so you can start training him. Or you have to stop and deal with the training at the worst time, the most inconvenient time when you got to get out the door or go to the doctor's appointment. No, the convenient thing about training sessions is you can actually schedule this into your day at a more convenient time. Although, of course, sometimes those responsive training sessions are going to be unavoidable, but the more preemptive training sessions we have, the less inconvenience and frustration later, and more importantly, the better behaved and more prepared for God the child will be. When we train them effectively, both we and they will have peace. When they're playing and they don't notice how close they are to the edge of the street, and you say, stop, and they freeze immediately rather than ignoring you until you've said it 5 times or until your voice reaches a certain decibel where your neighbors can hear it, or until the child is threatened with the counting game and you count to 4.5, 4 3/4. You're begging the child to obey you so you don't have to take the time and emotional drama to discipline the child. With proper training, we can virtually ensure that even a 6-month-old won't touch certain things. Now, obviously, as a child gets older, 8 months, 10 months, the reinforcement action is going to have to be a little heavier than a light pop or thump on the hand in order to get her attention and shock her. Your pop or thump will have to be more substantial. And ultimately, at a certain point, the child's old enough to understand English, understand your commands thoroughly, know better than to obey, they've already been trained, and yet proceed to go ahead and do what they want anyway, or is flippant about their obedience, or is unrepentant or defiant, or he's committing the childlike version of transgression or iniquity. And at that point, we transition over to the third step of child rearing to effect the appropriate change, what the Bible calls correction. So wrapping up this session, training, a crucial step in child rearing, a crucial step in preparing our children to live a life in service to God. And this would be another good thematic verse for this step. Hebrews 5:14, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Isn't that a good thematic verse for this concept? Our children aren't mature enough to discern good and evil at those younger ages. They have to be taught what's good and evil. And just as importantly, they have to be trained by constant practice to do the right thing. All right, tomorrow we'll tackle the very non-PC part of biblical child rearing, and that is correction. This is the one that the bulk of the world around us has abandoned, and which is in full-fledged attack mode on Christianity on this subject. And even within the church, we've got lots of people that are so unclear about what the Bible teaches on this, that they're in all-out rebellion against God on this subject. But hopefully you'll be able to be with us tomorrow for those 3 sessions, how important they are. And really, it's amazing to me how much the Bible has to say about this subject. It's not one or two passages. It is tons of material, a lot more explicit than you might realize on this topic. I didn't know how clear the Bible even lays out how this correction process really goes, how it's supposed to go with a child. And so hopefully it'll be enlightening to you and helpful to you, and especially in preparing you to evangelize to others or to deal with your own kiddos. All right, thank you for your attention this afternoon. David, I'll pass it back over to you.